My name is Vesper. I am 33 years old. 7 years ago, I stood at the Five-Lay Beebry dock, an edge of a mahogany casket, and watched my entire life be buried alive. The casket was supposedly occupied by my fiancé, a decorated fire investigator who had perished in a devastating warehouse blaze. My family, the city's elite, and every major news outlet mourned a hero. I was the only one mourning a ghost, and the only one who knew that before the fire took his life, he had systematically destroyed mine. I was branded a fraud, a disgraced journalist who had fabricated a massive corruption story. My family cut me off to protect their reputation. My sister used my downfall to launch her own career. For 7 years, I was a phantom in my own city. Then, last Tuesday, everything I knew turned to ash. I was covering a 4-alarm commercial fire in the industrial district. The heat was unbearable, the smoke thick enough to choke the light out of the sky. I had my camera raised, snapping the chaos. A firefighter in full turnout gear shoved past a burning barricade, his air tank hissing. He stopped dead. He looked directly at my lens. He reached up, unclasped his regulator, pulled off his soot-stained mask, and shouted my Name, not press, not hey. My name. I lowered the camera. Through the haze, the face of the man who had supposedly burned to death 7 years ago stared right back at me. He was older, scarred, but he was alive. And suddenly, the 7 years of hell I had endured wasn't just a tragedy. It was a crime. Before we get into the smoke and the wreckage, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story truly resonates with you. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know where you are right now. Now, let me take you back to the beginning, to the quiet, insidious way a family can dismantle you piece by piece, long before the matches are ever struck. Growing up, the hierarchy in our household was drawn with absolute precision. My father, Thaddeus, was an appellate court judge, a man who viewed human emotion as a procedural error. My mother, Xanthi, was the chairwoman of a prestigious philanthropic board, dealing in optics and high society currency. And then there was my sister, Isolde. Isolde was the golden equation they had been trying to solve. She played the cello, she captained the debate team, she dated the sons of state senators. Everything she did was curated for a press release. I was the variable they couldn't control. I didn't care about galas or networking. I cared about the truth. I became an investigative journalist. I started at a small independent paper, working 80-hour weeks, digging through public records, sitting in the back of dingy courtrooms. By the time I was 25, I was breaking front-page stories for the city's largest daily broadsheet. I thought, finally, I had found a way to earn their respect. I thought the truth was a universal currency. I was wrong. Let me give you a specific memory. It was November, 6 months before everything went up in flames. I had just won a regional press award for a sprawling investigative piece on the misuse of municipal funds. It was a big deal. The ceremony was at a downtown hotel. I had bought a new dress, a dark emerald silk, that made me feel, for the first time, like I belonged in the room. I had reserved a table for my family. At 7:30, the first course was served. My table was empty. At 8, they called my name. I walked to the stage, accepted the glass plaque, and looked out at a sea of applauding strangers. 4 empty chairs stared back at me from the center of the room. When I got home that night, my mother was in the kitchen, meticulously arranging floral centerpieces for Isolde's upcoming engagement party. I set the award on the granite counter. The glass made a sharp, heavy sound. My mother didn't even look up from her hydrangeas. "Oh, Vesper, I'm sorry," she said, her voice dripping with that manufactured sympathy she perfected for charity luncheons. Thaddeus was exhausted from chambers, and Isolde had a venue crisis. "You know how it is. We'll celebrate your little newspaper thing this weekend, all right?" My little newspaper thing. It was a piece that had indicted a corrupt alderman, but to them, it was a hobby that had rudely interrupted their schedule. I took the award, walked to my apartment, and put it in a drawer. I didn't look at it again. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I didn't need their validation because I had Kaylin. Kalen was a captain in the city's fire investigation unit. We met at a crime scene. He was charming, intense, and he looked at me like I was the only person in the world who actually understood him. He told me he admired my relentless pursuit of the facts. He said we were the same. For 2 years, he was my anchor. When my family dismissed me, Kalen would hold my hands and say, "They don't see you, Vesper. But I do. You're brilliant, and they're just afraid of the light." I didn't know it then, but Kalen wasn't admiring the light. He was studying it, figuring out exactly where the shadows were so he could hide in them. In my 26th year, I stumbled onto the story of a lifetime. I was investigating a series of commercial real estate fires in the lower district. The official narrative was faulty wiring, bad luck, ancient infrastructure. But the numbers didn't add up. The properties were all being bought up post-fire for pennies on the dollar by a single shell corporation. It was a massive arson-for-profit ring, and it involved high-level city developers. I needed an inside source to confirm the accelerants used in the blazes. I went to Kalen. I trusted him with my life. I showed him my notes, my timelines, the names of the shell companies. He looked at the documents on our kitchen table, his face pale, his jaw tight. "This is dangerous, Vesper," he had said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But you're right. I've seen the reports. They're being doctored at the top. I'll get you the unredacted files." For 3 weeks, Kalen fed me documents, lab reports showing chemical traces that had been scrubbed from the official records, emails between fire chiefs and city planners. It was a gold mine. I wrote the exposé. I submitted it to my editor. We ran it on a Sunday. It exploded. For 48 hours, I was the most celebrated journalist in the state. I thought I had finally arrived. I thought my family would finally look at me and see someone worthy of their name. On Tuesday morning, the police raided my apartment. They didn't knock. They breached the door. They seized my laptop, my hard drives, my physical files. I was dragged into a precinct interrogation room, handcuffed to a steel ring on the table. 2 detectives sat across from me and laid out a nightmare. The documents Kalen had given me were forged. The emails were traced back to an IP address registered to my own router. The lab reports were fabricated. "I didn't forge anything," I told them, my voice shaking so hard it cracked. "Kalen gave them to me. Captain Kalen Vance. Ask him. Call him right now." The lead detective looked at me with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. "Captain Vance came to us last night, Miss Vesper. He blew the whistle on you. He said he caught you fabricating the documents to make a name for yourself. He said you stole his login credentials to plant the emails." I couldn't breathe. The air in the room turned to lead. Kalen? Kalen had turned me in? It made no sense. Why would he frame me? Why would he lie? Before I could process the betrayal, the final nail was driven in. That same night, while I was sitting in a holding cell, a massive fire broke out at a chemical storage facility on the edge of the city. It was a 5-alarm inferno. Kalen was the lead investigator on site. According to the official report, the roof collapsed. His team made it out. Kalen did not. They found his badge, his melted radio, and dental fragments in the ash. I was released on bail the next morning, walking out of the precinct into a swarm of cameras. The headline was already printed. "Disgraced reporter. Fabricates arson ring, fiancé D's in blaze." The narrative was perfect. I was the ambitious, sociopathic journalist who faked a conspiracy, and Kalen was the tragic, noble hero who had tried to stop me, paying for it with his life. My father was the one who posted my bail. He didn't look at me when I got into his car. He drove in complete, suffocating silence to their estate. When we walked into the foyer, my mother and Isolde were waiting. Xanthi's face was a mask of cold, unadulterated fury. "You have destroyed us," she said. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "Is it true?" Just the immediate, instinctual calculation of the collateral damage to her social standing. "Mom, I didn't do it," I pleaded, tears finally spilling over. Kalen set me up. "The documents?" "Stop it!" Thaddeus roared. It was the first time I had ever heard him raise his voice. "The man is dead, Vesper. He burned to death trying to do his job, trying to clean up the mess you made. The police have the IP logs. The district Attorney called me personally to express his profound disappointment. You forged evidence. I am innocent, I whispered, looking at Isolde, begging my sister for a shred of doubt. Isolde just shook her head, stepping back from me like I was contagious. You need to leave, my mother said, her voice dropping back to that icy, controlled register. You will pack your things. You will not contact the press. You will plead guilty to whatever charges they bring, and you will not drag this family's name through a trial. If you fight this, Thaddeus will ensure you don't get a dime of legal help. They didn't just abandon me, they erased me. To save their own reputations, they leaned heavily into the tragedy. My mother started wearing black to her charity luncheons. Isolde gave tearful interviews to local magazines about the toll my mental breakdown had taken on their family. They turned my destruction into their own social capital. I was fired from the paper. The district attorney, eager to wrap up a high-profile mess without implicating any city developers, offered me a plea deal. Plead guilty to evidence tampering and obstruction, serve 3 years of 22 probation, and pay a massive fine. Or go to trial and face a decade in prison. With no money and a forged digital trail pointing straight at me, I took the plea. I had no fight left. I was completely broken. For 7 years, I lived in the shadows. I changed my last name to my Provit, grandmother's maiden name. I worked freelance editing jobs, ghostwriting, corporate copy, anything that didn't require a byline. I lived in a tiny studio, apartment, jumping every time a siren wailed in the distance. I convinced myself that Kalen had been a coward who got caught in his own web, framed me to save himself, and then tragically died before he could confess. I grieved the man I thought I loved, and I hated the man he actually was. And my family? They thrived. A year after the fire, Xanthi and Thaddeus launched the Kalen Vance Memorial Foundation, a charity dedicated to the families of fallen first responders. Isolde was made the executive director. They raised millions. They rubbed elbows with the mayor. They used the ghost of my fiancé to build an untouchable empire of goodwill. I was never invited to the galas. I was the dark family secret, the cautionary tale. I learned to survive by becoming invisible. But the thing about journalists is, even when you break our cameras, take our credentials, and burn our reputations, the instinct never dies. The itch to observe, to document, to seek the truth, it stays in your blood. So, a few months ago, I bought a cheap DSLR camera and a police scanner. I started doing freelance stringer work, night crawling, driving, to accidents, fires, and crime scenes in the dead of night, shooting raw footage and selling it anonymously to local news stations under a pseudonym. It was dangerous, low-paying work, but it was the only time I felt alive. It was the only time I felt like myself. Which brings me back to last Tuesday. The warehouse in the industrial district. It was 2 a.m. The scanner shrieked with a 4-alarm code. I was on the scene. Before the third engine arrived. The heat was immense, a physical wall pressing against my chest. Flames licked the night sky, turning the clouds a toxic, glowing orange. I was standing behind the yellow police tape, rain and ash, falling around me like gray snow. I had the camera pressed to my eye, adjusting the ISO, focusing on the structural collapse of the eastern wall. A squad of firefighters was pulling back, their oxygen alarms ringing. One of them, a tall man in a heavy turnout coat, got separated. He staggered toward the perimeter where I was standing, coughing violently. He leaned against the side of an ambulance, ripping the Velcro of his collar. He grabbed his helmet, threw it to the ground, and pulled off his breathing apparatus. I aimed the lens at him, looking for a human interest shot, the exhausted hero. He wiped the soot from his eyes. He looked up, his gaze locked onto the camera. Then, he looked over the lens, right into my eyes. The color drained from his ash-stained face. He didn't look confused. He looked terrified. "Vesper!" he shouted over the roar of the flames. My finger froze on the shutter. The world stopped spinning. The sirens, the shouting, the crackling of the fire, it all faded into absolute silence. I lowered the camera. The scar on his jaw was new. The lines around his eyes were deeper. But the eyes were the same. The voice was the same. It was Kalen. He was breathing heavily, staring at me as if I were a ghost. But I wasn't the ghost. He was. For 7 years, I had carried the guilt, the shame, and the absolute destruction of my life because this man had died in a fire. I had lost my family. I had lost my career. I had been branded a criminal. And here he was, standing 20 feet away, breathing the cold night air. He took a step toward me, his hand reaching out. Vesper, you're not supposed to be here. You're not supposed to be here, he said. The words barely cut through the chaotic symphony of shattering glass and screaming sirens, but they hit me with the force of a physical blow. He didn't sound like a man who had miraculously survived a tragedy. He sounded like a man who had just been caught in a lie. Before my paralyzed vocal cords could form a single syllable, a deafening crack fractured the air above us. The secondary roof of the warehouse gave way, sending a towering plume of superheated embers and black smoke cascading over the perimeter. The shockwave knocked me backward onto the wet asphalt. My camera slammed against my chest, the strap biting into the back of my neck. Shouts erupted from the battalion chief, ordering an immediate evacuation of the Brostard / staging zone. I scrambled to my hands and knees, the abrasive gravel tearing through my jeans, my eyes desperately searching the billowing smoke. Kaylin! I screamed, the ash searing my lungs. Kaylin. But the space where he had just stood was empty. There was only a discarded, soot-stained oxygen mask rolling slightly on the slanted pavement. Its gauge cracked. A pair of paramedics rushed past me, their heavy boots splashing in the chemical runoff, shouting for the injured. A police officer grabbed me by the shoulders, hauling me roughly to my feet. He yelled something about the blast radius, his face twisted in urgency, and shoved me forcefully toward the outer barricades. I fought him. I dug my heels into the pavement, twisting my body, my eyes wide and feral, scanning the retreating backs of the firefighters. None of them had his gait. None of them had his shoulders. He had vanished into the chaos, swallowed by the very element that was supposed to have killed him 7 years ago. The officer shoved me again, this time hard enough that I stumbled past the yellow caution tape and into the crowd of onlookers and displaced factory workers. I couldn't breathe. It wasn't the smoke. It was the sudden, violent compression of my reality. My hands shook so violently I could barely grip the posen edges of my own jacket. I stumbled down the flooded street, away from the flashing red and blue strobes, until I reached the dark alley where I had parked. My rust had set in. I collapsed into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, sealing myself in the quiet dark. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. He is dead, my mind chanted. He burned. They found his badge. They found his teeth. My trembling fingers fumbled for the camera resting against my chest. I hit the playback button. The small LCD screen illuminated the dark interior of my car with a harsh, artificial glow. I scrolled back. Past the collapsing walls, past the plumes of smoke, past the blurred motion of the retreating squad. And there it was. The image was perfectly exposed, frozen in high-definition clarity. The firefighter holding his helmet. The unclasped turnout collar. The face. I zoomed in until the pixels began to blur, but there was no mistaking it. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't a manifestation of my unresolved trauma. The distinct, jagged scar along his jawline, a souvenir from a childhood accident he had once traced with my hand, was right there. The slight asymmetry of his eyes. The permanent, cynical set of his mouth. Kaylin was alive. A sound escaped my throat, a ragged, guttural noise that was halfway between a sob and a scream. I dropped the camera onto the passenger seat and pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes until bursts of static exploded behind my eyelids. If Kaylin was alive, then the charred remains pulled from the chemical fire 7 years ago belonged to someone else. If the body belonged to someone else, the coroner had been bought, the police investigators had been complicit. The district attorney who had threatened me with a decade in prison had been reading from a script. It meant the arson-for-profit ring I had uncovered wasn't just a handful of corrupt developers. It was an infection that went straight to the people, bone of the city's infrastructure. And Kaylin was the architect. He hadn't just framed me to save his own skin. He had orchestrated his own martyrdom to close the investigation permanently. By dying, he became untouchable. By taking the blame for trying to stop me, he made me the perfect, indefensible scapegoat. The memory of his funeral crashed over me, suffocating and visceral. I remembered standing at the absolute periphery of the cemetery, hidden behind a Preisler-Schlossen, copse of weeping willows because the police had warned me that my presence would be considered an act of harassment against his grieving family. I had watched from the shadows. I remembered the mahogany casket, draped in the city flag. I remembered the honor guard, the pristine white gloves, the somber tolling of the silver bell. I remembered my father, Thaddeus, standing at the podium, his judicial posture rigid, delivering a eulogy that spoke of Kalen's unyielding integrity. I remembered my mother, Xanthi, dabbing her dry eyes with a black lace handkerchief, placing a hand on my sister Isolde's shoulder for the Loppling Zadores photographers. They had all looked so perfectly, elegantly bereaved. A sickening, icy dread began to pool in my stomach. Thaddeus was a judge. He had friends in the coroner's office. Xanthi ran the philanthropic circuits that funded half the city's political campaigns. Had they known? Had they helped bury an empty box, or worse, a murdered stranger, just to ensure the scandal was contained and their reputation remained untarnished? I opened my eyes, the cold air of the car biting at my tear-stained cheeks. I grabbed the camera again and stared at the photograph. The sadness and confusion were evaporating, burning off like morning fog under a scorching sun. In its place, a dark, venomous rage began to crystallize. I zoomed in on the details of Kalen's uniform in the picture. The jacket wasn't the standard tan and yellow of the municipal fire department. It was a deep, charcoal navy with muted, silver reflective striping. I panned the image across his chest. There was no municipal badge. Instead, there was a patch on his right shoulder. It was partially obscured by ash, but I could make out the shape. A geometric shield with a stylized flame in the center, and the letters OHM. I grabbed my phone, tethered it to my battered laptop on the passenger seat, and opened a secure browser. My fingers flew across the keyboard with a frantic, I practiced rhythm I hadn't used in 7 years. I ran searches for private fire, contractors, industrial hazard teams, and chemical containment units operating within the tri-state area. 15 minutes later, I hit a match. Obsidian Hazard Management. They were a highly privatized, elite hazard containment firm. They didn't put out house fires. They were contracted by massive industrial corporations to handle chemical spills, structural collapses, and toxic conflagrations. The kind of firm that operated with virtually zero municipal oversight. The kind of firm that charged millions of dollars in retainers. I pulled up their corporate filing history through a back-channel database I used to frequent in my investigative days. The company had been incorporated exactly 6.5 years ago. 6 months after Kalen died. I dug deeper, tracing the LLCs that held the controlling stakes in Obsidian. It was a labyrinth of ghost companies, registered in Delaware, funneling money through overseas trusts. But journalists know how to follow the money, and I knew the specific cadence of this particular corruption. I ran the names of the holding companies against the list I had compiled 7 years ago, the exact list of shell corporations buying up the burned real estate in the lower district. The overlap was a perfect, damning circle. The same shadow entities that had profited from the arsons I investigated were now funding the private hazard management firm that employed the dead man who framed me. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even go back to my tiny apartment. I sat in my car, parked under the amber glow of a flickering streetlight, building a digital dossier. By dawn, I had located Obsidian Hazard Management's primary staging facility. It was a massive, unmarked concrete compound on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by razor wire and high-definition security cameras. At 6 a.m., the sky bled a bruised, sullen purple. I drove to the industrial park, parking my sedan 3 blocks away, wedged between a rusted dumpster and a chain-link fence. I had a clear line of sight to the motorized security gate of the Obsidian compound. I pulled a thick wool beanie over my hair, slouched low in the driver's seat, and lifted a pair of high-powered binoculars to my eyes. I waited. The rain began to fall around 8 a.m., a cold, relentless drizzle that smeared The windshield. I didn't turn on the wipers. I barely blinked. I drank lukewarm coffee from a thermos, ignoring the sharp cramps in my legs and the exhaustion, pulling at my eyelids. Every time the heavy steel gate slid open to allow a black SUV or a specialized hazard truck to pass, my heart spiked. At 11:45 a.m., a sleek slate-gray Range Rover pulled out of the compound. The windows were heavily tinted, but the driver had rolled down the window just an inch to flick the ash of a cigarette into the rain. I focused the binoculars. The hand holding the cigarette had a thick, burn-scarred knuckle on the index finger. I knew that hand. I had held that hand. I dropped the binoculars, started the engine, and pulled out into the sparse, industrial traffic, keeping 2 cars between me and the Range Rover. The pursuit felt surreal. I was tailing a ghost through the city that had condemned me for his murder. Kalen drove with the relaxed, arrogant ease of a racontides of a passionately won man who owned the road. He didn't check his mirrors. He didn't take evasive turns. Why would he? He was dead. Nobody looks for a dead man. He drove toward the affluent west side of the city, the architecture shifting from brutalist concrete to manicured, tree-lined boulevards and towering glass facades. He pulled into the valet lane of an upscale, members-only dining club, the kind of place where a single lunch cost more than my monthly rent. The valet, wearing a crisp white vest, opened the door for him. Kalen stepped out. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that fit him immaculately. He looked wealthy. He looked powerful. He looked impossibly alive. He handed his keys to the valet, adjusted his cuffs, and walked through the brass-trimmed glass doors without a backward glance. I parked illegally in a loading zone across the street, my hands gripping the sedans, steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I couldn't go in. I was wearing ripped jeans, a stained jacket, and I looked exactly like the broken, disgraced outcast I was supposed to be. If he saw me in broad daylight, in a controlled environment, he would vanish again. He would call whoever protected him. And I would be the one who ended up disappearing permanently this time. So I waited. I pulled the camera from the passenger seat, attached a telephoto lens, and aimed it at the massive, floor-to-ceiling windows of the dining club. The interior was dimly lit, all rich mahogany and brass, but I could see him. Host led him to a secluded booth in the back corner. He sat down, ordered a saime drink, and checked his phone. He was waiting for someone. 10 minutes later, a black town car pulled up to the curb. The driver hurried out and opened the rear door with an umbrella. A woman stepped onto the pavement. She was wearing a perfectly tailored, bone-white trench coat, her dark hair pulled back into an elegant, severe chignon. She moved with a practiced, aristocratic grace, ignoring the rain entirely as she glided toward the entrance. I zoomed the lens in, trying to catch her face before she stepped inside. The camera autofocused, just as she turned her head to speak to the maître d'. My breath caught in my throat. The air vanished from the car. The world narrowed, down to the tiny digital square of my camera screen. It was Isolde, my sister. I watched through the lens as Isolde was escorted through the restaurant. She walked straight to the back corner. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look like a woman encountering the dead fiancé of her disgraced sister. She sat down, in the booth across from Kalen. He smiled at her. It was a familiar, conspiratorial smile. He reached across the Prostin's table, and Isolde placed her hand over his. I pressed the shutter button. Click, click, click. The sound of the camera mechanism was the only thing anchoring me to reality. My sister. My golden, untouchable sister, who had wept for the cameras, who had condemned me to my face, who ran the multi-million-dollar memorial foundation in his name. She wasn't just complicit, she was intimately involved. My stomach heaved. I opened the car door and leaned out into the rain, gasping for air, fighting the violent urge to vomit. The betrayal wasn't just a political maneuver. It was deeply, sickeningly personal. Isolde and Kalen. While I was risking my life, my career, my sanity to uncover the truth, they were building a future on the ashes of my existence. They had stolen my life to fund theirs. I pulled myself back into the car and wiped my mouth with the back of my hair, trembling hand. The despair that had defined the last 7 years of my life was suddenly entirely gone, incinerated by a profound, blinding clarity. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't a criminal. I was the victim of a spectacularly cruel execution, and the executioners were currently drinking champagne across the street. I lifted the camera again. I watched them talk, documenting every gesture, every smile, every touch. I didn't just want to prove Kalen was alive anymore. I wanted to burn their entire world to the ground. I wanted to take the empire they had built on my supposed madness and dismantle it brick by brick in the prided public square. But I was one disgraced journalist with a criminal record, up against a billionaire hazard management firm, a corrupt judicial dynasty, and a multi-million-dollar charitable foundation. If I simply went to the police, I would be dead by midnight. The local authorities were clearly bought. The district attorney was in my father's pocket. I needed evidence so absolute, so irrefutable, that no amount of money or influence could bury it. I needed to know exactly how the fake death was orchestrated. I needed the name of the corpse in the mahogany box. And to get that, I couldn't just stalk them from the street. I needed to get inside Obsidian. An hour later, Kalen and Isolde stood up. They kissed on the cheek, a polite, public parting, and went their separate ways. Isolde returned to her town car, undoubtedly heading back to the foundation to accept more donations in his memory. Kalen returned to the valet, got back into his Range Rover, and pulled away. I didn't follow him this time. I had a destination of my own. I drove to the southern edge of the city, to a neighborhood where the streetlights were shattered, and the police only responded in pairs. I pulled up to a dingy, reinforced steel door covered in graffiti. I knocked 3 times, paused, and knocked twice. The heavy door creaked open, revealing a man enveloped in the glow of a dozen computer monitors. His name was Caius. He was a digital ghost, an information broker I had used back when I was a legitimate reporter. He was paranoid, brilliant, and utterly devoid of moral allegiances. He only cared about the puzzle, and he only cared about the price. Caius squinted at me through thick, smudged glasses. He hadn't seen me in 7 years, but his expression didn't change. "You're supposed to be in hiding?" "Vesper," he murmured, stepping aside to let me in. "Word is, your shadow brings bad luck." "My luck just changed," I said, stepping into the chaotic, wire-strewn room. The smell of stale coffee and ozone hit me. "I need you to bypass a corporate firewall, top tier, military-grade encryption." Caius leaned back against his desk, crossing his arms. "Who is the target?" "Obsidian Hazard Management." Caius actually flinched. He shook his head immediately. "No, absolutely not. You. Don't touch Obsidian, Vesper. Those people make problems disappear permanently. They aren't just contractors, they're the cleaners for the worst corporate tactors in 434 syndicates on the seaboard. If I poke their servers, they won't just send a cease and desist. They'll send a team. "I don't need you to download their entire mainframe," I said, pulling a wad of cash from my pocket. My entire savings. Every dollar I had scavenged over 7 years. I threw it on his keyboard. "I need an employee roster. I need an architectural schematic of their compound. And I need the biometric access logs for their executive server room." Caius looked at the money, then looked at my face. He saw the terrifying, unblinking intensity in my eyes. "What the hell did you find, Vesper?" I pulled the camera from my bag and turned the screen toward him. I showed him the photo of Kalen at the fire. Then, I showed him the photo of Kalen and Isolde at the restaurant. Caius stared at the screen. The blue light reflected in his glasses. He recognized Kalen immediately. Everyone in the city knew the face of the martyred hero. Caius exhaled a long, slow breath, running a hand over his face. "If he's alive," Caius whispered, the realization dawning on him. "Then your entire conviction was a hit job," I finished, my voice cold as ice. "They stole my life, Caius. Now I'm going to take theirs. Are you in, or do I find someone else?" Caius stared at the cash. He stared at the photos. Finally, he turned around and dropped into his ergonomic chair. His fingers hovered over the mechanical keyboard. "Give me 3 hours," he said, the rhythmic clacking of keys already filling the room. "But Vesper, once you cross this line, there is no going back. If they catch you inside that compound, you won't get a trial. You'll just be another industrial accident." "I know," I said, staring at the digital image of the man who had ruined me. But I've already been dead for 7 years. It's time to see how they like the heat. 3 hours later, Caius hit the enter key with a resounding, definitive clack. A printer in the corner whirred to life, spitting out 3 heavily redacted Bart of C, pages of schematics and code. They're arrogant, Caius murmured, rubbing his eyes beneath his smudged ploties and glasses. Their exterior security is a fortress biometrics, pressure sensors, thermal imaging. But their internal server architecture? It's sloppy. They assume nobody can breach the perimeter, so the interior data protocols are outdated. He handed me the freshly printed pages. The top sheet was an architectural blueprint of the obsidian compound. He tapped a red circle near the center of the structure. This is the primary data node, he explained, his voice low. It's housed in a sub-basement beneath the administrative wing. The only physical access point is a service elevator requiring a level 4 keycard and a localized retina scan. You can spoof the retina scan remotely by looping the camera feed, but you need that keycard to initiate the elevator. How do I get the card? I asked, scanning the labyrinthine corridors on the Retian. Blueprint. Caius tapped a second page, an employee manifest. You don't steal a card from the executives. You steal it from the invisible people. He pointed to a name near the bottom of the list, Elias Vance, maintenance supervisor, clearance. Level 4. Vance? I looked up, a cold spike of adrenaline hitting my chest. Is he related to Kalen? His uncle, Caius confirmed. Apparently, nepotism thrives even in shadow. Corporations. Elias works the graveyard shift, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. He handles HVAC maintenance for the server rooms to ensure they don't overheat. He carries a master key card. You get that card, I loop the retina scanner, and you have exactly 4 minutes inside that server room to download the files before 3 bros. The automated security sweep flags the anomaly. I folded the papers and shoved them into my jacket pocket. How do I get inside? The perimeter to get to Elias? Caius offered a grim, humorless smile. You don't sneak in, Vesper, you walk. Through the front gate. He handed me a final document. It was a perfectly forged work order for a third-party hazardous waste disposal company, complete with a QR code and a QR code, municipal routing number. Tomorrow is their scheduled chemical disposal day. The truck arrives at 2 a.m. You're going to intercept that truck before it gets there, borrow the driver's uniform, and drive it through the gates. Yourself. It was a suicidal plan. It required precision, luck, and an absolute disregard. For my own safety, it was perfect. Thank you, Caius, I said, turning toward the heavy steel door. Vesper, he called out, stopping me in my tracks. I looked back. He wasn't looking at his monitors anymore. He was looking at me with genuine apprehension. If you get the files, don't bring them to the police. Don't bring them to a judge. They're all compromised. You have to take it directly to the public. You have to broadcast it so wide and so fast that nobody can suppress it. I know exactly where I'm going to drop it, I replied, the image of my mother's upcoming charity gala flashing in my mind. I'm going to give them the headline of a lifetime. The next 24 hours were a blur of meticulous, paranoid preparation. I pawned my camera lenses to buy a cloned RFID skimmer, a high-capacity encrypted hard drive, and a cheap burner phone to communicate with Caius. I spent hours studying the blueprints until I could navigate the compound with my eyes closed. At 1 a.m. on Thursday, I parked my rusted sedan on a desolate stretch of access road 2 miles from the Obsidian compound. It was the only route the Obsidian compound chemical disposal truck could take. The rain had returned, a torrential downpour that turned the asphalt into a slick, black mirror. I popped the trunk, pulled out an orange traffic cone and a high-visibility vest, and set up a makeshift roadblock around a massive, jagged pothole I had, strategically deepened with a sledgehammer hours earlier. I stood in the shadows, beneath a dripping overpass, and waited. At 1:40 a.m., the heavy rumble of a diesel engine echoed through the rain. The disposal truck, a hulking white beast with a toxic hazard diamond painted on the fake Zentini, side rounded the bend. The driver spotted the cones, slowed down, and brought the vehicle to a sputtering halt, hitting the air brakes with a loud hiss. He climbed out of the cab, muttering curses, pulling his reins slicker tight around his neck. He walked toward the front of the truck to inspect the roadblock. I stepped out from the shadows behind him, holding a heavy steel tire iron. I didn't want to hurt him. I brought the iron down hard against the side of the Blank's Etterdian 8, a truck's metal chassis. The resounding clang made the driver jump out of his skin. He spun around, slipping on the wet asphalt, and fell hard onto his back, knocking the wind out of his lungs. Before he could recover, I was standing over him, the tire iron raised just enough to look menacing. "Don't move," I ordered, my voice disguised, harsh and commanding. "Take off the slicker and the coveralls. Toss them over. Do it now, and you walk away." The driver, wide-eyed and gasping for air, didn't argue. He scrambled out of the heavy dark blue coveralls and the bright yellow slicker, tossing them onto the Pracher, wet pavement. He was left in his thermal underwear, shivering in the downpour. "Run," I said, pointing the tire iron back down the dark road. "Don't look." Back. He scrambled to his feet and sprinted into the darkness. I stripped off my wet jacket and pulled the oversized coveralls over my clothes. The smell of industrial bleach and stale sweat was overwhelming. I slipped into the yellow slicker, pulled the hood low over my face, and climbed into the cab of the truck. My heart hammered against my ribs as I threw the heavy vehicle into gear. The digital clock on the dashboard read 1:52 a.m. I had an 8-minute drive to the gates of hell. The obsidian compound loomed out of the storm like a concrete fortress. Towering, floodlights cut through the rain, illuminating the massive steel gates and the plaint's fortified guardhouse. I pulled the truck up to the intercom, the diesel engine idling loudly. A guard stepped out, flanked by 2 armed contractors holding semi-automatic rifles slung across their chests. He held up a scanner. I rolled down the window, just enough to hand him the forged work order Caius had provided, keeping my taller bar, face obscured by the shadow of the hood. The guard didn't even look at me. He scanned the QR code. The machine beeped, a sharp, authoritative green light flashing in the darkness. "Bay 4, the guard grunted, handing the paper back. The massive steel gates groaned and slid open. I was in. I drove the truck slowly through the compound, my eyes darting beneath the hood, memorizing camera placements and guard rotations. I pulled into loading bay 4, a cavernous, echoing concrete structure filled with chemical drums. I parked, killed the engine, and stepped out. According to Caius's intel, Elias Vance's office was situated at the end of the point, adjacent maintenance corridor. I walked purposefully, adopting the heavy, exhausted gait of a graveyard shift worker. I passed 2 contractors in tactical bay gear. They didn't even glance at the person in the bright yellow slicker. 2 from them, I was part of the machinery, invisible and irrelevant. I found the maintenance office. The door was ajar. I peered inside. It was a small, cluttered room smelling of ozone and cheap cigars. An older man, bearing a striking, unsettling resemblance to Kalen, was slumped in a rolling chair, snoring softly. A portable television flickered on the desk, playing a silent infomercial. And there, resting on the edge of the metal desk beside a half-empty mug of coffee, was the level 4 keycard, attached to a retractable lanyard. I held my breath. I stepped into the room. The floorboards creaked. Elias snorted, shifting in his chair, but his eyes remained closed. I moved with agonizing slowness, my gloved hand reaching out over the desk. My fingers closed around the plastic card. I gently unclipped it from the lanyard, leaving the empty string dangling. I slipped the card into my pocket and backed out of the room, dissolving into the shadows of the corridor. Phase 1 complete. I navigated the labyrinthine hallways toward the administrative wing, my heart racing against the clock. The architecture shifted from raw concrete to polished linoleum and frosted glass. I found the service elevator hidden behind a set of double utility doors. I pulled out the burner phone and texted Caius. At the door, loop the camera. 10 seconds later, the phone buzzed once. The green light on the retina scanner above the elevator panel flickered, then held a steady, solid green. The feed was looped. I swiped Elias's keycard. The heavy elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the sub-basement. The descent felt like descending into a tomb. The air grew perceptibly colder, humming with the massive electrical output of the server farms. The doors opened. The server room was vast, an ocean of blinking blue and green, LED lights housed in towering black racks. The sheer volume of data, the secrets, of 100 corrupt politicians and a dozen shadow corporations, pulsed in the 40 and 40, freezing air. I rushed to the central terminal, a standalone console in the center of the room. I plugged in the encrypted hard drive and began typing frantically, bypassing the localized firewalls using the backdoor access codes Caius had provided. The screen flared to life. I initiated a root-level search for specific terms. Vesper, Kalen Vance, arson ring, chemical warehouse fire. The results populated instantly. Hundreds of files, financial ledgers, internal, memos, autopsy reports. I began the transfer. A progress bar appeared on the screen, crawling forward, with agonizing slowness. 10%. 20%. I opened one of the files while the transfer ran. It was an internal memo dated 7 years ago, signed by the CEO of Obsidian, addressed to Kalen Vance. Subject: Project Martyr. Kalen, the acquisition of the lower district properties is complete. The investigative journalist, Vesper, has become a critical liability. Her latest, expose risks exposing the shell companies. We are activating Project Martyr. Your official death will be staged at the designated chemical facility. The coroner has secured an unidentified John Doe, matching your approximate height and build, to be placed at the scene prior to ignition. The dental records have been swapped. The IP logs framing Vesper have been successfully planted on her personal router. Upon completion, you will assume your new operational identity within Obsidian. The journalist will take the fall, the investigation will be closed, and your family has agreed to leverage the public sympathy to secure municipal contracts for the firm. Do not fail. I stared at the screen, the blue light washing over my face. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it was breathtaking. My parents hadn't just been ignorant, beneficiaries of the tragedy. They were actively involved. They had agreed to leverage my destruction and Kalen's fake death to secure government contracts. They traded their daughter's life for political power and wealth. 50%, 60%. You shouldn't be reading that, Vesper. The voice echoed through the massive server room, smooth and chillingly. Familiar. I froze. The blood drained from my face, pooling in my boots. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. I slowly turned away from the console. Kalen Vance stood 30 feet away, leaning casually against a server rack. I wasn't wearing his tactical gear or his tailored suit. He was wearing dark jeans and a black sweater, a suppressed pistol held loosely in his right hand. The scar on his jaw caught the harsh blue light of the servers. You always were too smart for your own good, Kalen said, his voice laced with genuine regret. When the perimeter sensors picked up the anomaly with the waste truck, I knew. Nobody breaches Obsidian, nobody except a desperate, disgraced reporter with nothing left to lose. I looked at the gun, then back to his face. The face I had loved, the face I had mourned. You let me grieve you, I whispered, the betrayal burning hotter than any fire. You let me go to jail. You let my family disown me. Kalen sighed, taking a slow step toward me. It was business, Vesper. You were going to expose a billion-dollar syndicate. You left us no choice. You were a collateral necessity. But you were supposed to stay broken. You were supposed to stay in the shadows. 80%, 90%. I glanced at the screen out of the corner of my eye. The progress bar was almost full. I just needed 30 more seconds. My parents knew, I said, keeping my voice steady, drawing his attention back. To me, Thaddeus and Xanthi. They signed off on it. Kalen offered a bitter, cynical laugh. Signed off on it? Vesper, your mother, practically orchestrated it. When Obsidian approached them about the impending lauded scandal, Xanthi saw the opportunity. A martyred hero son-in-law? A tragic foundation? It was the ultimate social currency. They didn't just throw you under the bus. They drove the damn thing. They thought you were unstable. A liability to their pristine image. This solved all their problems. The revelation was a physical weight, crushing the last microscopic shred of hope I had that my family had simply been misled. They were monsters. 98%, 99%. And Isolde? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Kalen's eyes softened, a sick, twisted affection flashing across his face. Isolde understood the assignment. She knew what needed to be done. We've been very happy, Vesper. Quietly, of course. Osuta biche. Transfer complete. I ripped the encrypted hard drive from the console and shoved it deep into the pocket of the yellow slicker. Kalen raised the suppressed pistol, aiming it directly at my chest. Give me the drive, Vesper. You know I won't let you walk out of here. If you give it to me, I promise I'll make it quick. No fire this time. I looked at him, staring down the barrel of the gun. 7 years of fear, of hiding, of believing I was unworthy of love or truth, vanished entirely. I wasn't the scared, broken girl in the interrogation room anymore. I was a journalist, and I had the story. You made one mistake, Kalen, I said, my voice ringing clear and authoritative. In the freezing room. And what's that? He asked, his finger tightening on the trigger. You forgot that I investigate fires, I said, a dark smile spreading across my stumen face. I know exactly how to start one. I reached into my other pocket and pulled out the emergency flare I had swiped from the cab of the disposal truck. I cracked the top. The flare hissed to life, a blinding, sputtering crimson light that immediately triggered the room's blank, sensitive thermal sensors. Before Kalen could react, before he could pull the trigger, I threw the burning flare directly into the massive, open ventilation shaft above the server racks. The automated Halon fire suppression system shrieked to life. The Halon fire suppression system shrieked to life, a deafening, mechanical scream that echoed through the cavernous server room. It didn't release water. Water destroys servers. Halon displaces oxygen. It starves the fire and anything else breathing in the room. Instantly, a thick, milky white gas blasted from the ceiling vents, cascading downward like an avalanche. The temperature plummeted. The harsh blue LED lights of the servers were swallowed by the opaque fog. Kalen fired. The suppressed gunshot was a muted thwip over the blaring alarms. I heard the bullet shatter the plastic casing of a server rack 3 feet to my one end, left, showering me in sparks and fragmented circuit boards. He was shooting. Blint. I didn't run toward the door. That's exactly where he expected me to go. Instead, I dropped to the freezing floor, commando crawling beneath the raised access panels that housed the massive cooling pipes. The halon gas was heavier than air, settling quickly, biting at my lungs and making my eyes water. I had less than 90 seconds before asphyxiation set in. Vesper! Kalen's voice echoed through the fog, tight with panic and rage. I heard his heavy boots slamming against the floor grates as he moved blindly toward the main console. He was coughing violently now, the gas already doing NRS its work. I crawled past his boots, hidden by the dense white cloud and the labyrinth of server racks. I reached the service elevator. The doors were locked, requiring the keycard to exit. My fingers, numb and trembling from the cold and the adrenaline, fumbled in my pocket. I pulled out Elias's keycard and swiped it against the low-mounted emergency panel. The light flashed green. The doors slid open with a soft chime. Kalen heard the sound. He turned, firing blindly into the fog toward the elevator. A bullet ricocheted off the steel doorframe, inches from my head. I scrambled into the elevator, slammed my hand against the button for the ground floor, and watched through the narrowing gap of the closing doors. Kalen stumbled out of the white fog, his gun raised, his face twisted in a desperate snarl. The halon gas was choking him, his chest heaving as he fought for oxygen. The doors sealed shut just as he reached them. The elevator shot upward, leaving the tomb of the sub-basement behind. I slumped against the stainless steel wall, gasping for air, clutching the encrypted hard drive to my chest like a newborn child. My heart was hammering so violently I thought it might crack my ribs. I had the files. I had the truth. The doors opened on the administrative level. Red emergency strobe lights pulsed, frantically, painting the corridor in bloody, rhythmic flashes. The alarm klaxons were blaring, a continuous, deafening wail. The compound was in full lockdown. Obsidian's automated security protocols had been triggered by the GATA halon release. I sprinted down the hallway, ditching the bright yellow slicker and the heavy down coveralls. I was back in my dark jeans and black jacket, blending into the Tainas Lanan I made as shadows. I passed two administrative workers who were rushing toward the fire. Exits, panic written across their faces. They didn't even look at me. In a crisis, everyone looks for an exit, not an intruder. I burst through the emergency stairwell doors and emerged into the loading bay. The massive steel gates of the compound were already rolling shut. The lockdown, protocol sealing the perimeter. My stolen disposal truck was still parked in Bay 4. But the guards were swarming, rifles raised, shouting orders into their radios. I couldn't go out the front. I needed an alternative route. I remembered Caius's blueprints. There was an industrial drainage culvert on the western edge of the property, designed to funnel chemical runoff into the city's main sewer line during heavy storms. It was barred, but the bars were old, rusted from years of toxic exposure. I ran toward the western perimeter, slipping behind a row of massive, cylindrical chemical tanks. The rain was still coming down in sheets, washing away my footprints and masking the sound of my movement. I reached the concrete culvert. It was a gaping black maw in the earth, sealed by a heavy iron grate. I grabbed the tire iron I had tucked into my belt and jammed it between the blunt, rusted bars, using all my strength to lever them apart. The iron groaned, fighting me. I could hear the shouts of the obsidian contractors growing closer. They were sweeping the perimeter with high-powered flashlights, the beams cutting through the rain like solid beams of white light. "Check the western tanks," a voice barked, not 50 feet away. I threw my entire body weight onto the tire iron. With a sharp, metallic screech, the rusted bolts gave way. The grate swung outward just enough for me to squeeze through. I slipped into the culvert, plunging waist-deep into freezing, foul-smelling water. I pulled the grate shut behind me just as the beam of a flashlight swept over the concrete where I had been standing a second before. I waded through the darkness. The encrypted hard drive held high above the day, contaminated water. The tunnel echoed with the sound of the storm drains above. It was horrific, claustrophobic, and entirely terrifying, but I didn't care. With every step away from the compound, the crushing weight of the last 7 years began to lift. I emerged from a storm drain 2 miles away, shivering uncontrollably, covered in filth, and completely exhausted. I climbed out onto the deserted street, finding my rusted sedan exactly where I had left it. I threw myself into the Ploskli driver's seat, locked the doors, and blasted the heater. I didn't drive home. I drove straight to Caius. He opened his reinforced steel door before I even knocked, his eyes wide. He took one look at my bruised face, soaking wet clothes, and the terrified, triumphant fire in my eyes. "You're alive," he breathed, stepping aside. "I got it," I said, pulling the encrypted drive from my jacket and placing it on his desk. It was wet, but the casing was sealed. I got everything. Project Martyr, the financial ledgers, the shell companies, emails between Kalen, the CEO of Obsidian, and my parents. Caius plugged the drive into an isolated terminal. His fingers flew across the keyboard. As the files populated on his massive monitors, his jaw dropped. "Vesper," he whispered, scrolling through the documents. "This isn't just an expose. This is a nuclear bomb. This implicates the district attorney, half the blank, city council, and your entire family. If we release this, Obsidian will burn, but they'll hunt you to the ends of the earth." "Let them try," I said, staring at the digital signature of the mother who had sold me out for a charity gala. "I want it formatted. I want the documents authenticated. I want a digital dossier prepped for every major news outlet, every independent investigative journalist, and every federal oversight committee in the country." "When do we drop it?" Caius asked, his eyes reflecting the glow of the screens, the thrill of the hack overriding his paranoia. I checked the clock on the wall. It was 5 a.m. on Friday. "Tomorrow night," I said, my voice cold and absolute. "At 8 o'clock. "Why tomorrow night at 8? "Because tomorrow night is the annual Kalen Vance Memorial Gala," I replied, a dark, vindictive smile touching my lips, "and I'm going to be the guest of honor." The next 36 hours were a masterclass in controlled chaos, while Caius scrubbed the metadata and built an uncrackable, decentralized distribution network for the files. I prepared for my resurrection. I couldn't walk into the blank/and-day grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel looking like a ghost from the gutters. I needed to look like the daughter they had buried. I used the last of Caius's untraceable funds to buy a dress. Not just any dress. An emerald silk gown, identical to the one I had worn 7 years ago on the night I won my press award, the night my family had left 4 empty chairs at my table. I had my hair styled, my makeup meticulously applied to hide the prudence, exhaustion, and the bruising from my escape. I looked sharp. I looked dangerous. I looked exactly like Vesper. Saturday night arrived. The city was thrumming with the artificial, glittering energy of the elite. The Pierre Hotel was cordoned off with velvet ropes, surrounded by a swarm of paparazzi and local news vans. This was the social event of the season. The Kalen Vance Memorial Foundation was expected to raise over $5 million in a single evening. I arrived in an unmarked town car at 7:45 p.m. The rain had cleared, leaving the city slick and reflective. I stepped out of the car, pulling the emerald silk around me. I didn't use the main entrance. I knew the security would flag my face. Instead, I used a service corridor I had scouted years ago when I was a legitimate reporter covering political fundraisers. I slipped past the kitchen staff, navigating the labyrinth of back hallways, until I reached the heavy, gilded doors of the grand ballroom. I could hear the grand ballroom, muted hum of a string quartet and the clinking of crystal glasses. I checked my burner phone. To Daddy, Simity Blent, T Daddy. Caius. The network is primed. Dissemination triggers in exactly 2 minutes. I pushed the gilded doors open. The ballroom was breathtaking. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow. Over 300 of the city's most powerful people. The men were in tailored tuxedos. The women in haute couture. In the center of the room, on a raised dais, sat my family. Thaddeus, looking regal and severe. Xanthi, wearing an expression of practiced, tragic nobility. And Isolde, dripping in diamonds, smiling demurely for the photographers. Behind them hung a massive 2-story portrait of Kalen Vance in his firefighter uniform, looking stoic and heroic. I stepped into the room. I didn't sneak in. I didn't hide in the shadows. I walked straight down the prazer, center aisle, the emerald silk whispering against the marble floor. It took exactly 20 seconds for someone to notice me. A prominent city councilman who had once tried to silence my investigations dropped his champagne flute. The crystal shattered on the floor, a sharp, violent sound that cut through the polite murmurs. Heads began to turn. The whispers started, rippling outward like a stone dropped in a still pond. Is that? It can't be. The disgraced sister? What is she doing here? I kept walking, my eyes locked dead ahead on the dais. My mother saw me first. The practiced, tragic nobility vanished from Xanthi's face, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. She gripped the blank edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. Thaddeus stood up abruptly, his chair screeching against the floorboards. Isolde dropped her fork. She looked like she had seen a ghost. And in a way, she had. I stopped at the foot of the dais, exactly 10 feet from the table where my family sat, bathed in the flashing lights of the paparazzi, who were suddenly far more interested in the exiled daughter than the charitable donations. Vesper, Thaddeus hissed, his voice low and venomous, trying to maintain the optics for the crowd. What is the meaning of this? You are not welcome here. Security will remove you immediately. I wouldn't do that, Thaddeus, I said, my voice carrying clearly in the sudden, suffocating silence of the ballroom. I didn't call him Dad. He hadn't been my father for 7 years. You are disrupting a memorial for a hero, Xanthi interjected, her voice trembling with fury, desperately trying to commandeer the narrative. A man who died because of your sociopathic lies. Have you no shame? A hero? I laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound that echoed off the chandeliers. Is that what we're calling him, Mother? A hero? I turned to face the crowd, to face the cameras that were now broadcasting live, to the local affiliates. I looked straight into the lenses. My name is Vesper, I announced, projecting my voice to the furthest corners of all the room. 7 years ago, I was accused of fabricating evidence against a corrupt real estate syndicate. I was told my fiancé, Captain Kalen Vance, died, trying to stop me. I was disowned by my family. I was forced into hiding. But I am not a criminal. And Kalen Vance is not a hero. And he is certainly not dead. The gasp that swept through the ballroom was collective and deafening. Shut her up! Thaddeus roared, abandoning his judicial composure entirely. He gestured frantically to the security guards lining the walls. Get her out of. Here! Kalen Vance is alive, I continued, ignoring the guards closing in. He faked his own death to protect $1 billion arson syndicate. He framed me to close the investigation. He now works as a high-level executive for Obsidian Hazard Management, the very company funded by the shell corporations that burned this city to the ground. Two massive security guards grabbed my arms. I didn't fight them. I didn't need to. I looked at my burner phone in my hand. Dapien Null Pay M. Simultaneously, across the ballroom, every single smartphone in the pockets and purses of the 300 guests buzzed, pinged, and vibrated. The journalists in the room, the ones covering the gala, were the first to look at their screens. Caius hadn't just sent an email. He had executed a mass data dump. He had hijacked the hotel's Wi-Fi network, pushing the dossier directly to every device in the building, while simultaneously emailing it to every news desk, federal, prosecutor, and oversight committee in the nation. I watched the faces of the crowd change. The confusion turned to shock, and the seated are clued. Shock turned to absolute horrified realization. A reporter from the city's largest daily, the paper that had fired me 7 years ago, stared at her phone, her mouth hanging open. My God, she whispered, her voice carrying in the silent room. It's all here. The financial ledgers, the fake autopsy report, the IP logs. She looked up at the dais, her eyes locking onto my parents. The letters. There are signed agreements between Obsidian and the Vance Foundation. They knew. They traded her silence for corporate sponsorships. The ballroom erupted. It wasn't a murmur. It was an explosion. Cameras flashed. Like strobe lights, but they weren't pointed at me anymore. They were pointed at the dais. They were pointed at Xanthi, who was shrinking back in her chair, her face devoid of blood. They were pointed at Thaddeus, who was staring at his Tonner phone in absolute, paralyzing terror, watching his judicial career, his legacy, and his freedom disintegrate in real time. And Isolde, I said, my voice cutting through the chaos. The security guards had let go of my arms, too stunned by the notifications on their own phones to care about removing me. I stepped closer to the dais, looking directly into my sister's eyes. Did you enjoy your lunch at the dining club on Thursday? How is Kalen doing these days? Does he miss being dead? Isolde burst into tears, covering her face with her hands, the diamonds on her, wrists catching the light as her carefully constructed life collapsed. You're insane, Xanthi shrieked, a desperate, cornered animal. These are forgeries! This is a malicious attack by a sick woman. They're not forgeries, Mother, I said, my voice calm, steady, and loud enough for every microphone in the room to pick up. They're the original documents, pulled directly from Obsidian's internal servers. And right now, the FBI is likely raiding their compound. The local police can't protect you anymore. The DA can't protect you anymore. It's out. It's all out. I didn't stay to watch them get arrested. I didn't need to. The screaming, the flashing cameras, the absolute, catastrophic destruction of the empire they had, built on my supposed madness, was enough. I turned around and walked out of the ballroom, the emerald silk trailing behind. Nobody tried to stop me. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, staring at me, with a mixture of awe and terror. I wasn't the disgraced daughter anymore. I was the journalist who had just brought down the most powerful syndicate in the State. I walked out of the Pierre Hotel, out into the cool, clear night air. The rain had finally stopped. For the first time in 7 years, I took a deep breath, and the air didn't taste like ash. I didn't go back to my rusted sedan. That car was registered to my alias. It was a known variable now. I walked 3 blocks, slipping into the anonymous flow of the late-night city crowds, and descended into the subway system. The fluorescent lights of the underground station buzzed, casting a sickly, pale illumination over the empty platform. I sat on a graffiti-scarred wooden bench, the emerald silk of my dress pooling around my ankles starkly out of place. Among the discarded Metro cards and damp concrete, I pulled out my burner phone. The screen was a chaotic waterfall of news alerts. Scandal at Memorial Gala. Dead fiancé alive? Judge Thaddeus implicated in massive corruption leak. FBI raids Obsidian Hazard Management Headquarters. I watched a live stream from a local news chopper. The footage showed the Obsidian compound, the fortress I had infiltrated hours earlier, surrounded by dozens of federal vehicles. Tactical teams and windbreakers were breaching the gates, but the satisfaction I expected, the overwhelming catharsis of vengeance, felt remarkably hollow. I knew how power worked in this city. A digital data dump, no matter how explosive, was just the first tremor of an earthquake. Obsidian was a hydra. They had lawyers who specialized in plausible deniability, and they had deep pockets to buy experts who would swear under oath that the files were sophisticated deepfakes, engineered by a vengeful, unstable woman. My phone vibrated in my palm. It wasn't a news alert. It was an encrypted text. From Caius. "They are scrubbing." My blood went cold. I typed back immediately. Explain. "Obsidian's legal team is already flooding the networks with counter-narratives." Caius replied, the text appearing in rapid, frantic bursts. "They are claiming the data is fabricated. But worse, Vesper, they are burning the physical evidence." I intercepted a radio relay. "They are torching their off-site storage facilities. If they destroy the physical ledgers and the original hard copy, contracts with your father, the digital files will be tied up in litigation for a decade. The executives will walk. Kalen will disappear again." I squeezed my eyes shut, the exhaustion finally threatening to drag me under. Of course they were. Fire was their preferred method of erasure. It was how they buried the truth 7 years ago, and it was how they would bury it tonight. "Where's the primary physical ledger?" I typed. "According to the internal memos we pulled, it's not at the compound. It's kept in a secure vault at the architectural firm that originally designed the lower district warehouses. It's an old building in the garment district. Vesper, you have to stay out of this. You did your part. The feds will be too late," I interrupted, my thumbs flying over the screen. "Send me the address." Caius didn't argue. He knew me too well. A string of coordinates appeared on my screen, followed by a final, ominous warning. "Vesper, Obsidian's internal communications just went dark. That means they've deployed the cleaners. They know you're the source. You are the only person who can physically testify to seeing Kalen alive in that compound. If they silence you, they can spin the narrative. You are the loose end. Do not go to your apartment. Do not trust anyone." I crushed the burner phone in my hand, stood up, and boarded the incoming train. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels against the steel tracks felt like a countdown. The garment district was a ghost town at 3 in the morning. Towering brick, lofts, remnants of an industrial past, cast long, jagged shadows over the point an industrial past. Cobblestone streets. I stepped out of a stolen taxi 2 blocks away, shivering, in the cold dampness. The emerald dress was a liability now, a beacon in the stack pit. Darkness. I ducked into a narrow alley behind a closed textile shop and found an LERW, abandoned, oversized canvas jacket draped over a stack of wooden pallets. It smelled of mildew and stale tobacco, but I pulled it on, wrapping it tightly over the silk, obscuring my profile. The architectural firm was housed in a narrow, 6-story brick building flanked by boarded-up storefronts. The wrought iron sign above the door read Aethelgard and Sons. It looked abandoned, a relic forgotten by the relentless modernization of the city. But the digital lock on the heavy reinforced door was state-of-the-art. I didn't have Caius to loop the cameras this time. I had to rely on the brute force hacking tool he had given me days ago, a small, black, rectangular device that plugged directly into the diagnostic port of commercial magnetic locks. I crept up the concrete steps, keeping my head down to avoid the obvious sightline of the dome camera perched above the door. I jammed the device into the port. A series of red numbers flashed furiously across its tiny screen, running through thousands of permutation codes in seconds. The silence of the street was agonizing. Every distant siren, every gust of wind rattling the loose trash cans, sounded like an approaching hit. Squad. Click. The heavy lock disengaged. I pulled the door open and slipped inside, plunging into absolute darkness. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and dust. I pulled a small penlight from my pocket, clicking it on. The narrow beam cut through the gloom, revealing a reception area frozen in time-heavy oak desks, brass lamps, and walls lined with framed architectural blueprints. According to Caius's brief, the vault wasn't in the basement. It was on the top floor, hidden behind the senior partner's private office. I took the stairs. The elevator was too loud, too exposing. I climbed 5 flights, the canvas jacket heavy on my shoulders, the adrenaline pushing my thymus-greedan, aching muscles past their breaking point. The 6th floor was a cavernous open-plan drafting room. Massive slanted tables were covered in rolling sheets of vellum and drafting tools. At the far end of the room was a heavy mahogany door. I crossed the floor, my footsteps muffled by the thick, dusty carpet. I pushed the door open. The office was immaculate, and there, built flush into the brickwork behind a sleigh, large mahogany desk, was a brushed steel vault door. I stepped toward it, shining the penlight over the biometric keypad. It required a thumbprint and a 6-digit code. I didn't have either. I was wondering if you'd figure it out. The voice came from the shadows in the corner of the room. It wasn't the smooth, arrogant tone Kaylin usually adopted. It was raw. It was ragged. I spun around, dropping the penlight. It rolled across the carpet, casting wild, spinning shadows across the walls. Kaylin stepped out of the darkness. He looked horrific. The immaculate, powerful executive I had seen at the dining club was gone. His face was pale, glistening. With sweat, his eyes bloodshot and wide. The halon gas had taken a brutal toll on his lungs. His breathing was a harsh, wet rasp. He was holding a heavy, matte black revolver. It wasn't the suppressed high-tech weapon he had in the Plosente server room. It was a brutal, old-school piece of iron. "You survived the vault," I said, my voice barely a whisper, forcing myself to remain perfectly still. "Barely," he wheezed, taking a step closer, the gun leveled squarely at my chest. The emergency venting system kicked in after 4 minutes. I woke up on the floor. I watched my entire life, my entire empire, dissolve on a television screen in the paramedics' bay. Because of you. Because of you, I corrected, a cold, hard edge bleeding into my voice. You built a house of cards on top of my grave, Kaylin. Did you really think I was just going to stay buried? He coughed, a violent spasm that shook his entire frame. But the gun didn't waver. "You don't understand how this works, Vesper. You think sending a few emails makes you a hero? Obsidian is mobilizing. The board members, the politicians, they are already spinning the narrative. They will crush the digital evidence. And when they find your body in this building, along with the ashes of this ledger, they'll say you were a deranged stalker who broke in, started a fire, and died in your own psychotic crusade. You can't sell that story twice," I said, staring him down. "Watch me," he sneered. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a heavy, brass Zippo lighter. With his thumb, he snapped it open. The flame illuminated his hollowed-out features. "The physical ledger is inside that vault. I have the code. I have the biometric clearance. I'm going to open it. I'm going to burn every single page, and then I'm going to put a bullet in your heart. If you kill me, the FBI will tear your life apart," I said desperately, scanning the room for anything I could use as a weapon. A brass paperweight on the desk, a heavy floor lamp. "I'm already a dead man, Vesper," Kaylin laughed, a sound completely devoid of sanity. "I died 7 years ago, remember? I'll just become someone else. Obsidian has the resources to make me vanish into thin air. But you? You end? Here." He stepped past me, keeping the gun trained on my face, and approached the gun-aced informations. "Vault." He pressed his thumb against the scanner. A soft chime echoed in the plans. Quiet room. He quickly punched in a 6-digit code. The heavy steel bolts retracted with a deep, satisfying thunk. He pulled the vault door open. Inside, resting on a velvet-lined shelf, were 3 heavy leather-bound ledgers. The physical proof, the undeniable ink and paper documentation of every bribe, every shell company transfer, and every forged contract that tied Obsidian to the city's political elite. Kaylin reached in and grabbed the top ledger. He tossed it onto the mahogany desk. It landed with a heavy, final thud. "End of the line, Vesper," he said, bringing the flame of the Zippo closer to the brittle, aged paper of the ledger. I didn't think. I reacted. The survival instinct that had kept me alive in the shadows for 7 years took over completely. I didn't lunge for Kalen. I lunged for the heavy oak drafting chair beside the one desk. I grabbed it by the backrest and hurled it with all my strength directly at the floor-to-ceiling window behind him. The glass shattered with a deafening, explosive crash. The cold night wind howled into the room, sending a hurricane of drafting papers, blueprints, and dust swirling into the air. The sudden explosion of noise and movement startled Kalen. He flinched the gun, jerking wildly to the right. The Zippo slipped from his fingers, tumbling onto the thick carpet. I didn't wait for him to recover. I dove across the mahogany desk, my hands closing around the heavy brass paperweight. I scrambled over the polished wood, launching myself directly at him. He fired. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space, a concussive blast that made my ears ring instantly. The bullet tore through the canvas jacket, grazing my shoulder. A hot, searing pain ripped through my arm, but the adrenaline masked the shock. I crashed into him, driving the brass paperweight into the side of his skull. Kalen grunted, stumbling backward, dropping the revolver. We hit the floor in a tangle of limbs. He was heavier, stronger, but he was compromised. His lungs were still raw from the halon gas, and the impact had dazed him. He threw a wild, desperate punch that caught my jaw, snapping my head back. I tasted copper. He scrambled toward the revolver resting on the carpet a few feet away. I grabbed his ankle, twisting violently. He kicked out, his heavy boot catching my ribs, knocking the wind out of me. I gasped, rolling away, my hand brushing against the discarded Zippo lighter. The flame had gone out, but the metal was still warm. I scrambled to my feet. Just as Kalen reached the gun, he turned over, leveling the barrel at my face, a bloody smile twisting his lips. "Nice try, Vesper. You forgot one thing about me, Kalen," I gasped, clutching my bleeding shoulder. "What's that?" he sneered. "I don't play by your rules anymore." I didn't throw the lighter at him. I threw it at the heavy velvet draperies, framing the shattered window. The fabric, ancient and coated in decades of dust, had already been singed when the lighter initially fell. As the heavy brass hit the floor, a stray spark from the flint ignited the dry, frayed edges of the Prussian curtain. Within seconds, the fabric caught. A wall of bright, searing orange flame shot up toward the ceiling. The wind howling through the broken window fanned the fire, turning the velvet into a terrifying, roaring inferno. Kalen hesitated. His eyes darted to the fire, the primal fear of a man who had staged his own death by burning suddenly faced with the real thing. His trauma, the lie he had lived for 7 years, paralyzed him for exactly 2 seconds. It was all I needed. I lunged for the mahogany desk, grabbed the heavy leather-bound ledger, and bolted for the door. "No!" Kalen screamed, firing the revolver blindly through the thickening smoke. The bullet shattered the doorframe inches from my head. I threw myself into the hallway, slamming the heavy mahogany door shut behind me. The smoke alarms in the building finally triggered, a shrill, piercing wail that echoed down the stairwell. I didn't look back. I clutched the ledger to my chest, my blood soaking through the canvas jacket, and ran down the 5 flights of stairs as fast as my houseless, trembling legs would carry me. The smell of smoke was already filling the shaft. The fire was spreading fast, consuming the dry, ancient wood of the Frive architectural firm. I burst out the front door, stumbling onto the cobblestone street. The cold, night air hit my lungs like glass. I collapsed against a parked car, gasping for breath, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I looked at the heavy leather book and pay. My arms. I had it. The physical proof. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. The fire department was coming. I looked up at the 6th floor. Flames were licking out of the shattered window, painting the brick facade in a demonic, flickering glow. I watched, waiting to see if Kalen would emerge. If he would find a way to cheat death a second time. He didn't. I pulled my burner phone from my pocket with blood-slicked fingers and dialed the only number that mattered. "Caius," I breathed, my voice hoarse. "Vesper, thank God. Are you all right? The police scanners are going crazy." "I have the ledger," I said, leaning against the cold metal of the car. "The original. The signatures are all here." "Where are you?" Caius demanded. "I'm sending a secure transport." "No," I replied, staring at the burning building. "I don't need a transport. Call the FBI. Tell them to meet me at the Federal Plaza. Tell them the architect of the Obsidian Syndicate is ready to turn over the physical evidence. I hung up the phone. I peeled the heavy, blood-soaked canvas jacket off my plowed shoulders and let it drop to the wet cobblestones. I stood there in the emerald silk dress, stained with soot and blood, clutching the book that would tear the one city's corrupt elite down to their foundations. I started walking toward the Federal Plaza. I didn't hide in the shadows anymore. I walked straight down the center of the avenue, under the harsh glare of the streetlights. For 7 years, I was a ghost. Tonight, I was the resurrection. The walk to the Federal Plaza took 30 minutes. The city was a surreal, disjointed landscape in the pre-dawn hours. Police cruisers screamed past me, their sirens tearing through the silence, entirely focused on the raging fire I had left behind in the garment district. Nobody noticed the woman in the torn emerald silk dress, bleeding and covered in soot, walking purposefully down the middle of the empty avenue. I felt untethered, floating somewhere between the P-Play's absolute terror of the night and a cold, crystallized resolve. The leather-bound ledger in my arms felt heavier than a tombstone. It was the physical weight of my vindication. When the towering, brutalist architecture of the Federal Plaza finally loomed into view, it was already swarming with activity. Unmarked black SUVs were parked haphazardly on the plaza steps. Men and women in dark windbreakers, emblazoned with the FBI logo, were securing the perimeter, their faces tense, illuminated by the harsh glare of halogen floodlights. The digital data dump Caius had orchestrated was having exactly the effect I intended. The federal machine was waking up, furious and hungry. I stopped at the edge of the plaza, just beyond the reach of the floodlights. A pair of federal agents standing near the entrance spotted me. They immediately unholstered their weapons, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, blinding me. "Stop right there," one of them shouted, his voice echoing off the concrete. "Keep your hands where we can see them." I didn't flinch. I slowly raised my hands, holding the heavy leather ledger up, for them to see. "My name is Vesper," I called out, my voice raspy but steady. "I am the source of the Obsidian data leak. I have the physical ledger. I need to speak to the Praxis lead prosecutor." The agents exchanged a rapid, incredulous glance. The name Vesper was currently flashing across every secure channel in the country. They lowered their weapons slightly, but their posture remained coiled, defensive. "Walk forward slowly," the agent commanded. I stepped into the light. When they saw the blood soaking the shoulder of my T-blood dress, the soot smeared across my face, and the absolute, unyielding intensity, in my eyes, their demeanor shifted from hostile to urgently professional. They flanked me, taking the ledger from my trembling hands, and rushed me through the talbot, heavy glass doors of the federal building. The next 48 hours were a relentless, grueling interrogation. I was placed in a secure, windowless conference room deep within the federal complex. A parade of prosecutors, FBI special agents, and forensic accountants cycled through the room, cross-examining every detail of my story. They scrutinized the placed digital files Caius had distributed. They authenticated the physical ledger I had salvaged from the fire. They demanded the exact timeline of Kaylin's fake death, my parents' complicity, and my infiltration of the Obsidian compound. I told them everything. I didn't hold back. I detailed how my father, Judge Thaddeus, had used his influence to secure the forged autopsy report. I explained how my mother, Xanthi, had leveraged the tragedy to secure municipal contracts for Obsidian through the Kaylin Vance Memorial Foundation. I described in painstaking detail the moment I saw Kaylin at the warehouse fire and the horrifying confrontation in the server room. The lead prosecutor, a hardened, cynical woman named Agent Miller, sat across from me on the second night. She was reviewing a stack of preliminary leverzo indictments, her brow furrowed. "The physical ledger corroborates the digital files perfectly," Miller said, her voice betraying a hint of genuine awe. "The signatures are authentic. The financial trails align with the shell companies. We have enough here to dismantle Obsidian entirely. And we have enough to arrest your parents for fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy." She paused, looking at me over the rim of her glasses. "But the fire at the architectural firm. The local fire department found human remains in the ashes of the 6th floor office. My breath caught. I stared at the metal table, the memory of Kalen aiming the gun at my face flashing violently in my mind. Is it him? We are running dental and DNA, but based on the tactical gear and the proximity to the vault, it's highly probable. It seems Kalen Vance couldn't escape the fire a second time. Miller sighed, closing the folder. If the remains are his, it closes a massive loop for us. It proves he was alive post 2016. But it also means the primary architect of the conspiracy is dead. We will have to rely entirely on the documentary evidence to prosecute the remaining conspirators. The evidence is solid, I said, my voice hollow. I didn't feel relief that Kalen was dead. I just felt an overwhelming, crushing fatigue. The man who had destroyed my life, who had lied to my face, who had tried to execute me, was, finally, truly gone. But the damage he had orchestrated was still a festering wound. It is, Miller agreed. Your parents were taken into federal custody 4 hours ago. Their assets have been frozen. The Kalen Vance Memorial Foundation has been seized. Isolde is currently cooperating with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. The entire city's political infrastructure is in freefall. Miller stood up, extending her hand across the table. You did an extraordinary thing, Vesper. You broke a syndicate that we've been trying to crack for a decade. The Attorney General is personally reviewing your case. The charges against you from 7 years ago are going to be vacated. You're going to be fully exonerated. I looked at her hand, but I didn't shake it. I don't care about the exoneration, I said quietly. I just want my life back. It took 6 months for the dust to settle. The fallout was catastrophic and utterly public. The trial of Thaddeus and Xanthi was the most sensational legal spectacle the city had seen in a century. Every major news network carried the proceedings live. I sat in the gallery on the final day of the trial. I wore a sharp, tailored, black suit. I wasn't hiding anymore. I watched as my father, stripped of his judicial robes, wearing an ill-fitting orange jumpsuit, stood before a federal Avuel daughter. Judge. He looked frail, broken, a shadow of the arrogant patriarch who had banished me. My mother, Xanthi, sat beside him, weeping silently, her carefully constructed social empire reduced to scandalous headlines and frozen bank accounts. When the guilty verdicts were read, conspiracy, fraud, obstruction, accessory to, arson, I didn't feel triumph. I didn't smile. I just watched them be led away in handcuffs. I felt a profound, echoing emptiness. They had traded their daughter for power, and in the end, they had lost both. Isolde received 5 years in a minimum security federal facility, her cooperation barely saving her from a decade. Obsidian Hazard Management was dismantled, its executives indicted, its assets seized to pay restitution to the 4022 families whose homes had been burned in the lower district. My exoneration was swift and absolute. The district attorney who had originally prosecuted me was forced to resign in disgrace. The city issued a formal apology. The newspaper that had fired me offered me a senior investigative position, complete with a 6-figure salary and creative control. I declined. I didn't want to go back to the life I had before. That Vesper was naive. She believed that truth was enough to protect her, that justice was an inevitable consequence of exposing a lie. I knew better now. I knew that the truth was fragile, easily buried beneath money, power, and the terrifying willingness of people to believe a convenient tragedy over an inconvenient reality. Instead, I took the settlement money from my wrongful conviction lawsuit and opened my own independent investigative agency. I specialized in corporate corruption and municipal fraud. I didn't answer to editors, and I didn't care about the social elite. I worked in the shadows, pulling the threads that nobody else wanted to touch. Caius became my silent partner. He stayed in his bunker, running the digital architecture of our operations, entirely funded and completely off the grid. We were a 2-person wrecking crew, dismantling the corrupt syndicates that thought they were untouchable. A year after the gala, I was sitting in my new office, a converted loft overlooking the harbor. It was late. The city lights reflected off the dark water. I was reviewing a dossier on a corrupt shipping conglomerate, sipping black coffee. My assistant, a sharp, observant woman named Elena, knocked softly on the clom door frame. "There's a package for you, Vesper," she said, holding a small, unadorned cardboard box. It was delivered by courier. No return address. I frowned, taking the box from her. "Did it pass the security scan?" "Clean," Elena confirmed. "No explosives, no tracking devices." "Thank you. That will be all for tonight." Elena nodded and left the office, closing the door behind her. I set the box on my desk. I stared at it for a long moment, my instincts humming with a familiar, low-level paranoia. I pulled a letter opener from my drawer and sliced through the packing tape. Inside the box, resting on a bed of bubble wrap, was a small, heavy object. I lifted it out. It was a heavy brass Zippo lighter. It was identical to the one Kaylin had dropped in the architectural firm. The one I had used to start the fire. The one that was supposedly buried in the ashes along with his remains. My heart stopped. The air in the office suddenly felt freezing. I turned the lighter over in my hand. Scratched crudely into the polished brass, barely legible, were 3 words. "See you soon." I stared at the scratched letters, the blood roaring in my ears. The FBI had confirmed the remains in the fire were Kaylin's. They had run the dental records. They had closed the case. But I had learned, in the most brutal way possible, that dental records could be swapped. A body could be planted. A man who specialized in staging his own death in a fire could certainly do it twice. Obsidian had immense resources. They had cleaners. If Kaylin had anticipated the fire, if he had an extraction protocol. I slammed the lighter down on my desk. I didn't panic. I didn't scream. The paralyzing terror that had defined my past was gone. I reached for my secure phone and dialed Caius. He answered on the first ring. "Vesper, what do you need?" "I need you to pull the autopsy report on the remains found in the Aethelgard." "Fire," I said, my voice cold, sharp, and terrifyingly calm. "I need the name of the forensic odontologist who signed off on the dental records. I need his financial history for the last 12 months. And I need you to initiate a deep web scan for any new shell companies registered in Delaware under the GAY. Initials KV. Caius paused. The silence on the line was heavy. "Vesper, you think he got out?" "I don't think," I replied, staring at the brass lighter gleaming under my desk. "Lamp, I know." "If he's alive," Caius warned, his voice tight, "he's not running a corporation. Anymore. He's a ghost. He's hunting you." I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the sprawling, glittering expanse of the city. The shadows were deep, hiding 1,000 secrets, 1,000 lies. But I wasn't afraid of the dark anymore. I had learned how to navigate it. I had learned how to burn it down. "Let him hunt," I said, a dark, fearless smile touching my lips. "I'm not the disgraced sister hiding in a studio apartment anymore, Caius. I am the woman who dismantled his empire. If he wants to come for me, let him come. I'll be waiting." I hung up the phone. I picked up the Zippo lighter, flicked it open, and struck the flint. The flame sparked to life, a bright, defiant crimson against the darkness of the office. I snapped it shut. The story wasn't over. It was just changing chapters. The ashes had settled, but the embers were still glowing, waiting for the wind to catch. And this time, I wasn't going to be the one who burned. I am Vesper. I am 34 years old, and I am ready for the fire.